go now? Cool. Good morning. Oh, it's not that late yet. Let's try this again. Good morning. There you go. Thank you. My name is Jason Buffington. I'm a senior product manager in the management and security team at Microsoft. We manage the System Center and Forefront products. This may not have been exactly how the session was originally labeled in your session guide, but I'm thinking of this as DPM Part 2 of 3. Yesterday, we talked a little about in the server track on how to install a basic DPM server. And then tomorrow, I'm going to go back in the server track, and we're going to talk about disaster recovery and virtualization. But in today's session, I really just want to talk really in the nitty-gritty about how does DPM protect SharePoint, and while we're at it, we need to have a good understanding of how to protect SQL at the same time. If you have questions that I don't get a chance to answer today, please send those to me in email. You can reach me at jbuff, J-B-U-F-F, at Microsoft.com. I'm going to point you to a few resources on my blog today, and that's pretty simple, just jasonbuffington.com. And if you tweet, so do I, you can reach me as jbuff. All right, so as I mentioned, this is the second of 3 parts. And we will actually, as my one giveaway for this session, I do have a few copies of this. I'm going to try to give out at least one today. So ask really, really cool questions. All right. So what are we going to do? We're going to start off with a quick overview of what is DPM. And just a quick show of hands. Who in here already has hands-on experience with DPM 2007 today? Okay, maybe 30% of the room, all right. And who came to the Server 215 session, Technical Intro to DPM, yesterday? Might be the same hands, actually, just a few more. All right. Okay, so in order to catch the rest of the room up, I'm going to start off with just a very quick intro. What does DPM look like? And then from there, I'm going to do some demo, and we'll actually set up protection of a SharePoint farm and a couple SQL databases. And then I'm going to come back, and I'm going to tell you how does it really work. And then from there, we're going to talk about some new concepts as far as how we actually store the data in something called data collocation. And then I'm going to take you through the specifics of how does DPM protect SQL data versus how it protects SharePoint. And there are some differences there. So we're going to talk about that. And then we'll put everything back together again. And with any luck at all, we'll have a few minutes for questions. If not, then I'm going to take all the questions immediately outside the room as soon after so we can give space to the next presenter. All right. So quick overview of Data Protection Manager. What you're looking at here on the left-hand side are all the core workloads that DPM natively protects. Now, of course, today we're going to be focusing on SharePoint and SQL, but just for the record, it does also protect Exchange and Dynamics, which, by the way, really is mostly just SharePoint and SQL. Microsoft virtualization platforms, I'll talk about those tomorrow, Windows servers, and Windows desktops. Here's how this works. What we're going to do is we're going to put a DPM agent on each one of these production loads. By the way, it's the same agent. Okay, it's the same binary, it goes out to all the boxes. There's a 64-bit version and a 32-bit version, but in principle, you're pushing the same agent out everywhere. Based on what the agent sees on the box will determine what the behavior is of the agent, meaning what kind of stuff will it try to protect. But in all cases, what happens is this DPM agent is going to capture byte or block changes within your app and pull them back to a DPM server in the middle of the screen. All right, now that we have this live copy of the data, we're going to talk about how that live data actually moves in just a minute. But once we have that live copy of the data, now we can do a couple really cool things with it. We can hold previous points in time on disk, and that's going to give us really fast recovery points. We can hold the data on tape, and that's going to give us a long-term archive or retention of that data. And so, by the way, speaking of that, so what that means is if the only workloads that you predominantly rely on are on the left-hand side, then admittedly DPM is probably a displacement for whatever other kind of Windows tape backup technology you might be using today. And then lastly, if you do come to my server session tomorrow, I'm going to talk to you about how you can take your data from one DPM server, which is on-premise, and take that to another DPM server, which is off-premise, to give you disaster recovery, using all the same pieces we're going to talk about today. All right? So does that sound about right? Is that what you were looking for from a DPM solution? Heads nodding up and down in an affirming manner. Okay, great. So, all right, just a quick catch-up. These are the main workloads that DPM protects. It's pretty much everything in Windows desktops and Windows servers, which is currently shipping. And, of course, what we're talking about today really is around the application space. We're going to focus the conversation around SQL and around SharePoint, including the WSS and Foundation versions. All right, last slide before we get into the meat of the discussion for today. I mentioned before that DPM does get consumed as a single agent that goes out everywhere. However, I want to be fair about the idea that it actually doesn't cost the same. Okay, you're going to push the agent out, the same agent out everywhere, which means that's an operational benefit. You can use System Center Configuration Manager, System Center Essentials, Group Policy. Just push the agent out everywhere. Based on the behavior of what you choose to protect will determine what that agent actually counts as. So, for example, if I put that agent on a Windows server and I just protect files, I'm going to call that a standard data protection management license, or DPML. If I put the same agent on a client machine, Windows XP, or Windows Vista, or Windows 7, I'll call that a desktop agent, or a client data protection management license. And then lastly, what we want to talk about today is when you put a DPM agent on a SQL server or a SharePoint server, including the various component servers that make up that SharePoint farm, and you choose to protect a farm or a database, we're going to enumerate that as an enterprise data protection management license, or EDPML, which you should call an application agent. By the way, just one small piece of trivia. Enterprise Data Protection Management License for System Center Data Protection Manager 2010 is the longest single item in the Microsoft price list. So I'd share that with you. We had to change a margin, which is why I know. All right, so anyway, I'm going to pass through this. By the way, if you've already acquired System Center through the suites, meaning System Center SMSD or the System Essentials Plus, you already have all the software you need for this solution, literally. So you already own the agents for DPM. In fact, the enterprise agent comes in this stack. And with DPM, you don't pay for the server. You don't pay for the DPM server. So if you have the agents, you have use rights for the server. And if you have the System Center suites, you have the agents, you're ready to go. So let's talk about what we're going to do. So that's kind of a catch-up to get us started. So now what I want to do is I want to jump right into a demo. First thing we're going to do is we're going to set up protection for two reasons. One, because I think the UI actually talks about the product better than I do. And two, because a little bit later in the session, I'm going to need to be able to restore some data. And before I can restore some data, we have to have something backed up. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and jump into a demo to start. Let me reset that. Close that and close that. All right. So to start off, we're going to do what's called creating a protection group. And a protection group is just a policy. It's a policy that says, what do I want to protect, and how do I want to protect it? So we're on the first screen of the protection group, and the first thing I want to do is I want to choose the what do I want to protect. So to do that, this has got to be the shortest table known to man. Either that or I got really tall since I've been in Auckland, which would be very cool, but probably not true. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and open up a SQL server here so you can see what a base solution looks like. And anytime I open up any server that's got a DPM agent on it, I can always protect the shares that are on the box. In this case, there's only one. I can go old school and go and protect volumes and directories. And I can also protect system state, which includes bare metal recovery and as well as system state itself. So those options are true no matter what workload I protect in DPM. Now, what we're going to do today, though, is because the DPM agent sees that SQL Server is running on that box, it also gives us additional operations or options for that application. Specifically, if I open up a SQL Server, I'll see 3 instances of SQL. And I'm going to go ahead and open up one of those and grab some data. Here's a couple databases for you. And over on my legal instance of SQL, one of the new options we added with DPM 2010 is the ability to protect the entire instance of SQL, which means as new databases, including content databases in SharePoint, get created, we'll automatically add those for inclusion in our protection group as well. So in this case, let me show you that just by clicking the top of the instance. And now any new databases that get created here will also get protected. All right, I'm going to go a little quicker and open up another SQL server, get a little bit more data going. Payroll. Payroll is good data. We always want to protect that. Customers. All right. All right, so now I've got a good arrangement of SQL. Now let me go ahead and take a look at what's available in SharePoint. Now if I open up my SharePoint environment, notice here that I still see shares, I still see volumes, I still see system state, so all the things we already talked about before. I still see SQL. That's because this happens to be a standalone SharePoint 2007 server, which means it actually has its own instance of SQL running for its own content databases. But for now, we're not going to protect the database. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to close SQL up and open up a new object called SharePoint. And here I can actually see the entire logical farm as a single click. I'll go ahead and click that, and while I'm at it, I'll take the search components while I'm there. Now, in SharePoint 2010, the exposure looks a little bit different. I don't have to see the search to do this. I just grab the entire farm as an object. That's it. Now, I want to make sure this isn't lost on you, because one of the key ideas here is that one of the main reasons, let me roll this back a little bit. One of the main reasons that Microsoft built a backup product was because when we talk to you, especially around SharePoint 2007, who in here would consider themselves a relatively early adopter of SharePoint 2007? Okay, maybe about 15, 20% of the room. That's great. All right, so here's one of the things that folks like you told us when SharePoint 2007 first came out. You told us that when you were originally looking at SharePoint 2007, that your legacy backup solution might work great on the standalone SQL databases themselves, but they often choked when they tried to keep up with that organic farm that would continue to grow on its own as part of a SharePoint deployment. And so what you told us was, hey, I need to wait on fully deploying SharePoint until my legacy backup solution catches up. Right? One of the key areas that we often saw, by the way, saw the same thing with Exchange 2007, CCR, SCR, and Exchange 2010 DAG, also Hyper-VR 2. The scenario is that if the legacy backup solution isn't supporting you yet, you're not going to be able to deploy the full application. Well, in this case, one of the main reasons why many legacy solutions break is because they don't understand the concept of the farm. They're great with standalone SQL servers. You can point at each one of those SQL databases and back them up, and that's great. They just have no relevance to each other. Right? So in this case, what DPM does is you're going to protect the farm as a single object. It doesn't actually say the farm unless you actually called it the farm, but you didn't. Anyway, so you're going to call it the farm or protect it as a single object, and that's it. That's what you've chosen to protect. Now, later on, I'm going to tell you how that really works and how we discover all the components and pieces of the farm, but for now, that's what we've done. Now what I'm going to go ahead and do is call this SQL and SharePoint data. Now notice on that original solution diagram, I said we protect all the data from the servers on the left. We pull it to a DPM server that was in the middle of that diagram at the very beginning. And then from there, I said we could protect to disk or to tape or to both. That's it. It's a pair of checkboxes. Who in here has a heterogeneous server environment? You've got servers other than Windows. It's okay. It's all right. All right. So you got maybe about 30, 35% of the room. Actually, for the folks at home, only one person raised their hand. Anyway. So if you already have a heterogeneous backup solution, if you have a heterogeneous server solution, you probably already have heterogeneous backup. If you do, if you're using Networker, NetBackup, Tivoli, maybe ArcServe, you can go ahead and turn off our tape. Now what you've got is protecting all that Microsoft workloads to DPM disk, and then protecting that DPM disk to your Networker tape. That gives you one set of tapes across your heterogeneous enterprise, and yet still gives you that one throat to choke, wholly supported backup and recovery experience from Microsoft for SharePoint and SQL. Now, what I often find is people do that when they first deploy it, and about 6 months later they decide, you know what, I'd rather just run the whole thing through DPM, and so we'll turn that box back on. All right, let me kind of finish working through a few more things in the demo to draw your eye to. So I said earlier that a protection group is a policy. What do I want to protect? How do I want to protect it? We already did the what. Now let's talk about the how. As far as how the how goes, how you want to do disk-based protection is 2 business-driven questions with a few options. First business question, how long do I want to keep the data on disk? As a general rule, I like 14 days. How often do I want to do it? Every 15 minutes. That's it. From there, DPM goes ahead and figures out all the pieces and parts, and I'm going to show you exactly how that works in just a few minutes. I want to draw your eye to one more thing, though. Down here, it gives me an option for something called an express full, and I'm going to tell you how that works in just a minute. But for now, what you want to do is you want to think of an express full as when you normally do your normal backup-y kind of thing, whether that's 11 p.m. or 1 a.m. or whatever that happens to be. And I'll tell you the default is 8 p.m., and I actually think that's a little bit too early. So I'm going to go ahead and say it's going to be 11 p.m. I don't work on Sundays, so neither does my DPM server. All right? That's it. So I've done 2 choices, how long, how often, and I've tuned it a little bit. Now I'm going to go and say next. All right, 2 boxes here that are worth talking about. One of them I'll show you in just a few minutes is called co-location. In your back of your mind, just remember there's a checkbox for co-location. I'll tell you how that works in just a second. And then down here, there's this option for Automatically growing volumes. This is actually one of the most common things that was asked for from DPM 2007 to DPM 2010. Basically what it means is as your production data store grows, the DPM storage pool will automatically allocate additional space to keep up with it. In 2007, we didn't. So as your production volumes grew, you would routinely go back to the DPM server and add more storage, and add more storage, and add more storage. And you were routinely going back and doing that, say, perhaps every couple of weeks. Now it's checkbox. We'll take care of that for you. All right, keep on going. So that's disk. You said how long, how often, you tuned it a little bit. Tape works exactly the same way. How long? 3 months seems a little short again, so let's say 7 years. How often? Weekly. And that's going to go ahead and from there build you a grandfather, father, son, weekly, monthly, annual tape rotation system covering you for the next 7 years. And just like before, you can tune it. You can tune when those are actually going to kick off. And just like you can tune the storage before, you can also tune which media changers, media libraries you want to use. Do you want to compress your tapes? Do you want to encrypt the tapes, or neither? I want to go ahead and start this up now. I could also choose to schedule it for later to get my baseline done at a different time, but that would make the demo really anticlimactic. All right, and then lastly, this is something else that if you are a DPM 2007 customer, feel free to high-five the person next to you on this one. Here's what we did. We built an auto-heal feature that in DPM 2007, anyone ever see an error message that said replica inconsistent, must run a consistency check? Okay, no one raised their hand. That's good. Yeah, that was a pretty common thing in DPM 2007. VSS would have a problem. It would tell DPM about it. We would freak out. We would say, okay, we're going to stop until you fix it. Right? Now, in DPM 2007, we did that because surely you wouldn't want us to automatically run a comparison check and get everything cleaned back up again, because that could add a little bit of additional I/O during your production day. And what you told us about 3 years ago was, yes, that's exactly what I want. Go ahead and fix it, because I'm not going to back up anything until you do. Right? All right, so now it's checkbox. As I said, y'all feel free to high-five among yourselves. All right, so a lot of auto-heal, a lot of auto-grow in the products. I'll go ahead and say create group. This will say yes. And this is going to take a little while, maybe 5 to 10 minutes or so. So now I can go ahead and tell you what we just did. So there's two processes that actually happen when you're protecting SQL and SharePoint data. The first one is what's called an express full. Remember I showed you about that, and I said it's about 8 p.m. We're going to change it to 11 p.m., and I'll tell you why. Here's why. By the way, I know it's a little bit early in the morning for some of us, me included. So just in case you zone out on this part, this actual small segment is actually also available as a podcast. So if you have a friend who didn't get a chance to come to Tech Ed this year, they can actually just go out and either write down this URL very, very quickly, or you can do a Bing search and you can find it from there. You're searching for how does DPM really work. All right, so here's how it works. So in the UI, what we did was we chose the farm as a single object. Remember, it's not really called the farm unless you called it that, but in this case we didn't. So you checked a box called the farm. What happens is DPM then goes out and figures out what files and pieces make up that logical data source. In this case, what I found is I've got 2 SQL servers in the back end. I've got a total of 5 content databases that are part of that configuration. So now I know the files at a logical level that make up that data source. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go out and figure out the blocks on the disk that make up those files that make up that data source. So in this case, what I've got is a bitmap in this upper right-hand corner. It's a memory-based table, and there's a single bit, either a 0 or a 1, that points to any block that makes up one of those files that makes up that data source. All right, here's where it gets interesting. Now all I'm going to do is watch those blocks. I've got a production disk over in the lower left-hand corner, and a disk write happens, and when that 4 blocks get updated on that disk write, all I do is I flip those 4 bits in my bitmap to say, hey, those blocks got changed. I'm going to have to do something with those later. Another disk write happens, I flip more bits. Another disk write happens, I flip more bits. So all throughout the day, the only thing I have to do on those database servers is just flip the bits that says, hey, those blocks got flipped. Think of it just like a dirty page count. All right. Now, it's time for us to do an express full. Right? Now, I think we scheduled it for like 11 p.m. So when it's time for us to do an express full, what we're going to do is we just go get those blocks. We don't have to do any kind of comparison. We don't have to go back and do any kind of retro work. All we do is that becomes our pick list. We just go fetch those blocks. Now, there's a little bit of gotcha to this. If you just went and grabbed those blocks and you started grabbing them at whatever order the disk gave them to you, it would actually violate write order integrity, because what would happen is on the DPM server, if anything happened, the blocks didn't lay down the right way, they would match. And it would be really, really hard in order to get them back together again. So, in order to handle that, DPM actually uses a process called Volume Shadow Copy Services, or VSS, and VSS actually works in two ways. One, it works on the production server by snapping the production volume. So when VSS hits that production volume, it looks more like this, snaps it. Now those 17 blocks are frozen from our perspective. We can fetch them in whatever order we want. We can replicate just those 17 blocks across the wire. DPM server already has a copy of all the rest of the data. It just has to take those 17 blocks and lay them over the top. We good? Heads kind of nodding a little bit like this. This is not nodding, by the way. One of my pet peeves. All right. Now, of course, remember, this is the middle of the production day. Okay, so data is going to continue to happen while we're on that box. So one of the things with VSS is a function called copy on write, which basically means that while those 17 blocks are frozen to me, as the backup agent, server keeps on going. And just in case the server were to try to overwrite one of the blocks that I currently need and am owning, it'll actually just write it to a different area instead. Now, here's the fun part. Once I'm done sending those 17 blocks across the wire, I release the snap. There's no long-term disk residue. There's no disk consumption, no additional I/O penalty afterwards. Okay, so all I'm doing is on a regular basis, in this case, say 11 p.m., you might do it more often than that. You're going to snap that production volume. It's going to take just those change blocks, fish them across the wire, and apply them on top of a data set which is already current otherwise. All right. So that's half the story. Let's talk about what happens the other 23 and a half hours a day. Okay, so if we said that an express full happens 11 p.m., by the way, I should mention that, an express full, we call it an express full backup because it's kind of a full backup and kind of not. It is a full backup from the perspective that, normally when you think about recovery scenarios and you think about, hey, I got to restore all my data, first thing you do is you go get your full backup and you restore it because it's a complete set of your data, right? And then you'll go figure out how to catch it up. It is a full backup from that perspective. The DPM replica actually holds a live copy of the data in a native state. There really are MDFs and LDF files. There really is a meta directory. There really is all the original ACLs from your custom directories or from your 14 Hive or your 12 Hive. That's all there. So it is a full from that perspective. You got everything you need in one stroke. It is not a full backup from the perspective that normally when you do a full backup, you back up everything, regardless of how little or how much has changed, right? Okay, this doesn't do that. It only takes the granular pieces to go across. In fact, you will only do one real full backup ever. From that point on, it's just sending blocks. Okay, so you get the benefit of a full because you can restore in one stroke, but not the penalty of actually sending replicating or stagnant data every few days in order to catch back up again. All right. So that's what we call an express full. Now let's talk about the rest of the time. If that happens once or twice or 4 times a day, let's talk about the rest of the time. So to do that, remember in the DPM UI, I said I wanted to hold the data for 14 days, and then I just wanted to sync every 15 minutes. Here's what happens every 15 minutes. I start off with my production server. The first thing I do is I get my baseline. I get everything to match. There's that one-time full backup I mentioned. Now after that, every 15 minutes, as data changes within my production environment, I'm going to grab a T-SQL log backup of just the log file changes within those databases. Every 15 minutes, I'm going to ship just those log changes across over to the DPM server. Now I will tell you, when I first saw this, and I said, oh great, every 15 minutes I'm grabbing just those deltas within the log file, I'm shipping those across, and I'm just going to apply them to the DPM copy of the data, and that's great. That's not what we do. See, if we did that, that's called log shipping, right? If you want to do that, do log shipping. Okay, that's not what we do. Because log shipping is a replication technology for the purpose of near availability, right? You're constantly replicating, you're constantly applying so that if the production server dies, you have another copy which is nearly current and you can roll it forward, and how cool is that? That's not DPM's job. DPM's job is backup and recovery, to give you multiple previous points in time to roll back through. So I do replicate those logs every 15 minutes, but I don't apply them. I store them. In backup terms, these are my differentials. Right? So I've got a full backup from first thing this morning, say 1 o'clock in the morning, And then after that, I have the T-logs from SQL from 1 o'clock to 1:15. And then another one from 1:15 to 1:30. Another one from 1:30 to 1:45, which means if I want to recover a database to any point in time, what I do is I start with my baseline full, and then I just play the logs forward to whatever 50-minute chunk I want. Now, when I actually go through the restore scenarios, I'll show you, by the way, I will tell you, I am not a DBA. Okay? Don't even pretend to be one on TV. So in DPM, I can restore the data to any 15-minute point in time, and I'm going to show you how to do that in about 4 or 5 mouse clicks. A DBA can restore that data to any point in time, because they can restore the logs without playing them forward, and then use the journal to actually play it forward to any transaction they want. You want to restore it back to 207, let the DBA do it. You want to restore it back to 215, you can let me do that. All right, so here's what happened. That's what happened during day 1. Now, of course, throughout that day, I'm also flipping those bits. I'm watching those blocks as they get changed. It's time for my next nightly express full. So I snap the production volume. I take just those, 17 blocks and ship them across the wire, and everything matches again. But remember I said I use VSS in 2 ways. The second way I use VSS is to hold the block level differences between today's express full and yesterday's express full. And I keep the T-logs in between. All right, let's fast forward. Every 15 minutes, days are changing in my environment. Every 15 minutes, I'm shipping those T-log changes across. I'm keeping them as differentials on the other side. If I want to recover to previous point in time from today, I start with today's baseline. I play the logs forward, any 15-minute point in time from today. If I want to recover to previous point in time from yesterday, I have the baseline differences between yesterday's express full and today's express full, and then I take the T-logs right behind that, and I can recover to any previous point in time from yesterday. Another day happens, another express full. I'm going to do this in DPM 512 times. Now, over in that left-hand corner is a marketing claim. So I'm going to put on my I want to be a marketing guy hat for just a second. If I was a marketing guy, here's what I'd tell you. You have to do at least 1 express full per week. You got 512 of them. That means you could do 512 weeks worth, right? It's pretty good math, even if you're a marketing guy. Now, you could do 7 days times 24 hours times 4 times per hour worth of recovery points, which would actually give you, if I've got that math right in the lower left-hand corner, 344,000 individual recovery points spanning every 15-minute point in time for the next 9 years. Nobody's going to do that. Just want to make sure you're clear on that. There's 3 reasons why you're not going to do this. 1, it's a lot of disk. Even with our efficiency model, it's a lot of disk. 2, candidly, if you are using SharePoint 2007 and SQL 2005, Microsoft doesn't really want you on that 9 years from now, so you'll have upgraded something by then. And then 3rd, it's a lot of disk. Okay? No one's going to do that, but here's the punchline. There's 512 snaps, so why not do more than 1 per day? You could do 4 express fulls per day instead of 1. You'd still have 128 days worth. Do 6 per day. So I have 80 some odd days worth. Now we're into division. I can do multiplication, but division kind of eludes me. Anyway, so pop quiz, just to kind of keep you guys engaged. Why would I do more than 1 express full per day? Someone shout it out. Recover? A little louder. Right. Keep going. Truncating logs. Yeah, you actually could use it for the truncating logs part, but I'm actually looking for recovery time. Now, to be clear, you can recover at any 15-minute point in time regardless of whether you do 1 express full per day or 4 express fulls per day. But let's say that I do my express full exactly at midnight. And then every 15 minutes after that, I'm doing a log-based replication. That's great, except that if my server dies at 11:59, right, it's going to start at midnight. It's going to play forward 23 3/4 hours worth of transaction logs. And DPM will do that for you. It'll just play them forward to whatever 15-minute point you choose. You don't have to rotate anything. It's all great. But you do have to wait while it plays forward effectively 95 sets of log files. Okay? If you do more express fulls per day, where you're doing them, say, at 6 and 12 and 6 and 12, now if the server dies at 11:30 at night, you only have to start at 6 p.m. Right? Because that's your last express full. You only have to play forward like a dozen log files to get you back where you want to go. So anyway, so that's one of the rationales behind that, and that's going to make more sense as we talk about some of the workloads. All right, one more thing that's important to note about how this is actually working. When DPM actually stores the data, on your databases. In DPM 2007, so the last iteration, in DPM 2007, every time you choose a data source for protection, we slice 2 NTFS volumes out of our storage pool on the DPM box. Not really that big a deal. You've got this DPM appliance. You've got a whole bunch of raw storage. We slice it up for you, and that's great. Here's the fun part. And if you're here talking about SharePoint and SQL, this matters to you. Okay, so I think I said about 30% of the room was using DPM 2007 at one point. Raise your hand if you had over 100 databases being protected by DPM. Okay, good, a couple. Keep your hand up if you had more than 200 databases protected by 300. Okay, and all the hands pretty much always go down at 300. Let me tell you why. You carve out 2 NTFS partitions per data source. Every database is a data source. That's 600 partitions, right? Now you start to grow them a little bit. And when you grow them, you actually slice off new partitions and you just amend the blocks. So now you're at 800 partitions and you're at 900 partitions. And your disk administrator utility looks like a zipper. I mean, just... Here's the fun part. When you hit 1,000 partitions, Windows is done. Okay, it doesn't matter what else you were doing with it. Windows caps out around 1,000 NTFS partitions defined within NTFS. It's just done. All right, so let me, which basically meant that just like we saw with the people that raised their hands earlier, a single DPM server might protect 100, 150, 200 databases. But once you start getting around 225, maybe 250, and start getting close to that 300 number, you're going to stop using DPM as a single server for that because it didn't scale because of that 1,000 partition limit. Here's what DPM 2010 does. It has this feature called co-location. Remember I said there's this checkbox, and you're going to want to remember that. Co-location says instead of slicing out 2 partitions per data source, carve out 2 partitions per data type. So now all of my SQL databases go into one partition, and all of their recovery point volumes go into a second partition. Okay, and so this feature basically said, and if you're taking notes on scalability with DPM, here are the numbers. A single DPM 2010 server, in large part due to co-location, will support over 100 production servers, over 1,000 Windows clients, for today's conversation, over 2,000 SQL databases, an Exchange store of over 40 terabytes, and a SharePoint farm testing over 25 terabytes in size with over 1 million individual objects per DPM server. Okay, so those are our test numbers up through that. And by the way, all of this happens because of a checkbox. Turn the checkbox on, we just magically get bigger. I actually wanted them to call the checkbox mid-sized business or large enterprise, and the devs guys didn't get that. Anyway, so, all right. So that's how DPM works. That's actually moving the data. Now what I want to do is I want to talk about the specifics of how does a database get protected, and I'm going to roll that back and talk about how a SharePoint farm gets protected because they interrelate, and then I'll put everything back together again. Hopefully with time for some restore demos because those are really cool. All right, so some of the things in DPM 2010 is before when you wanted to protect, and you saw this before, we grabbed one or more databases in SQL and we protected just those individual databases back to a DPM server. One of the new things I showed you in DPM 2010 is the ability to protect an instance of SQL. And when I do that, all databases that are within that instance get created. And in fact, any new databases that get created will also get protected as well. The last piece, I'm going to show you this during the restore demo in a few seconds, is when I do want to restore a database, one of the new things we added in DPM 2010 is the ability for the DBA to restore your own databases. Just like we enable end users today to be able to restore their files straight from Windows Explorer, from Microsoft Office, you as a DBA can now bring up a small utility, looks almost identical to the DPM UI, and you can actually restore those databases directly from your SQL management console or from the DBA's laptop. Okay. If you're a DBA, again, feel free to high five among yourselves. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and show you that in just a few minutes when we do the restore scenario. A couple more things as far as SQL goes that you need to be aware of. When you are using a mirrored database scenario as part of SQL, we do protect for that. We will always follow the principal within the pair. So as that role switches from one to another, we will follow the principal within the combination. If you are using SQL aliasing so that so your SharePoint can actually always find the principal, we'll follow that as well. But we'll track the principal regardless of that. All right, if you're doing log shipping, anyone in here using log shipping on your SQL databases? Just a couple people? Okay. So if you're using log shipping on SQL, you might want to take a note of this. And I'm going to take off my DPM hat for just a second and just put on my generic backup dude hat. You never, ever, 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 and that's really important, so there's 4 of them. You never, ever, ever, ever want to have 2 things trunking your log files, right? The technical term that I use for this is icky bad. Here's what happens. You got a backup product, something other than DPM. It tries to back up your log files, and then afterwards, as a customer service feature, it truncates your logs. And then a few minutes later, log shipping kicks in. It ships your logs across to the server, and then afterwards, it trunks your logs. And then a little bit later, the backup server comes in, it does what it does to your log files, and it trunks your logs. And then over here, a few minutes later, log shipping comes in. By the way, there was a pattern, just so you know. All right, so it's going back and forth, and here's the fun part. Neither node has enough data to actually resume your data. Okay, because both sides are trunking what they get from that point forward. So, when you're making notes, you never, ever, ever, ever want 2 things to handle your logs simultaneously. So, if you tell DPM to back up a server where you have log shipping going on, the databases that are doing log shipping will automatically be excluded from that 15-minute replication. Okay, so that way we don't have anything touching your logs except for whatever you want to touch it. That also, by the way, holds true for databases that are running in simple recovery mode. So if you've got databases like master as an example that don't have a log file, okay, then what happens is we're only going to do the express fulls. Now, you can keep them in the same protection group if you want, but candidly, that's a good reason to use 2 protection groups. Have one protection group where you might say, do 1 express full per day, and the rest of the time, every 15 minutes, I'm getting logs, and that's great. Have a different protection group that says every 4 hours, I'm going to go ahead and do an express full because I don't have logs to work with. And that's going to shrink that granularity as far as what my control is going to look like. All right, a couple more things from a SQL perspective. We have the ability to, or now you have the ability to recover a SQL 2005 database to a SQL 2008 server, which makes for some really cool migration and test scenarios, just as a word of thought. See, I think I already covered those. That's just some summary screen. All right, so now let's look at what's important to note for SharePoint, and then I'm going to come back and finish off with some restore time. The big challenge, and this is kind of a wordy slide, and you can look at it later. Marketing guy wrote it. Here's the thing you want to think about. The biggest challenge in SharePoint isn't about the workload itself. It's about finding all the pieces and parts. Right? I mean, you can point any generic database. You can take NT backup and point it at that SQL server and that database, and you're done. Right? But it's actually finding the relevance between all the pieces, especially as new databases get created, and then what about the metadata? That's the part that's kind of funky about SharePoint. So the way DPM works is, well, I should mention, VSS is kind of our secret sauce. It's the piece that kind of helps us with everything else. It tells us how a database should be protected. It tells us how an Exchange storage group or a Hyper-V VM should be protected. Every workload that we've talked about with DPM, everything that's on that initial solution slide, has its own VSS writer, and that's how DPM interacts with it, except SharePoint 2003. Anyone using SharePoint 2003 or WSS 2.0 today? Okay, just a few. All right, just a few. So this is actually the only workload that we do that doesn't have its own native VSS writer. Now, thankfully, about 99.4% of SharePoint 2003 is SQL. In fact, really the only thing that's not in the SQL database in SharePoint 2003 is some metadata. So there's a utility called STS-ADM, and it does a whole bunch of different things. But one of the things it does is it dumps the metadata to a flat file. Okay, so what I would suggest to you is if you're having SharePoint 2003, you can use DPM to protect that, but you're actually going to be protecting the SQL databases. And as part of the process, there is a function in DPM called a pre-backup script. Basically, it'll fire every time that you want to do an express full. And what you'll want to do is configure a one-line script that runs the STS-ADM command and dumps that 0.6% metadata to a file. And then when you go and back up the database, oh, by the way, go grab that file while you're there. Okay, that's how you do SharePoint 2003. Now let me take you through SharePoint 2007 and 2010. So now I've got a much nicer looking farm. Here's how this works. You're going to put a DPM agent on every SQL server which is in your environment. You're going to put a DPM agent on at least one of your web front-end servers, as well as enterprise search if you're using a separate box in 2007. When you point DPM at it, what you're actually pointing us at is any one of your web front ends. When you do that, the SharePoint VSS writer will then tell us where all the rest of the pieces are. right? That's the whole idea, where everything else breaks and where we go in, because we weren't afraid to ask, hey, where's your stuff? Right? So we talked to web front end. The VSS writer says, okay, let me tell you where the stuff is. And then from that point on, we do what's called a referential VSS query, which is really a fancy way of saying, you told us where the pieces are, now we're going to go talk to them directly. That's it. All right. Now, common question, though. Remember, SharePoint Farm is an organic thing, right? So new servers get popped into this. Maybe it's content databases. And if a new content database gets created within a SQL server that I'm already protecting, I'll automatically protect that. Completely lights out. You'll never even know it happened. If you add a new content server, though, here's what's going to happen. First of all, you do need to make sure that you have an agent on that box, right? And by using System Center or group policy, you're going to have that agent automatically deployed, and so kumbaya there. So what happens is DPM goes out to the web front end and says, okay, it's time for that next expressible. It's time to get backed up again. SharePoint VSS writer comes back and does that referential VSS query response and says, okay, let me tell you where all the pieces are. And then from that point on, now I know about that new SQL server, and I'll just go ahead and continue to protect it. But the whole thing happens because you pointed at a single object called the farm. And then from there, the SharePoint VSS writer and DPM work together to go figure the pieces and parts, and we just talk to them from that point on. All right, a couple more things. I want to take you through a couple of restore scenarios. When you first started protecting the SharePoint farm, we have our storage pool on DPM on the right-hand side, and I'm going to start replicating all those pieces and parts across. Now it's going to be time for me to do recovery. Now, in SharePoint 2007, there was this really cool feature called the recovery farm. No one's giving me a thumbs up on that one. All right. Yeah, no, it wasn't a cool feature. Basically, the recovery farm feature works a lot like, anyone in here use Exchange also? Or manage Exchange as part of your environment? Maybe 20% of them? All right. So if you're an Exchange person, you've heard of this thing called the Recovery Storage Group. In Exchange 2010, they call it the Recovery Database. Recovery Farm works the same way. Basically what it was in SharePoint 2007, just like in Exchange 07 and 10, you weren't allowed to take data directly from your backup repository and drop it and inject it directly back into the production farm. Not supported. So in SharePoint 2007, they had this concept called a recovery farm, which basically meant you could choose individual items you wanted to recover. And then when you chose those items, it would take the database that those items were in and recover the whole database someplace. And then from there, you could SharePoint's APIs would then go grab the item that you had selected and drop it back to where it's supposed to go. So here's what it would look like. I want to recover a Word document. It's held in some document list somewhere. DPM recovers the database into this concept called a recovery farm. In the recovery farm, it actually can open it up and it can see the actual file system and structure, and it drops the Word document back down. Honestly, the recovery farm wasn't that big a deal. You just had to install a generic instance of SharePoint. It had to match service packs and hotfixes and that kind of thing. And frankly, I usually use mine inside of a virtual machine. But a lot of folks said, surely there's got to be a better way to do this. And there was. So in SharePoint 2010, there is no recovery farm. Okay? And since SharePoint doesn't require a recovery farm, neither does DPM. However, remember that when you're protecting the content databases, you are protecting SQL databases. So inside the DPM storage pool, that's still what I've got. I've got MDFs, I've got LDFs, and then I've got the file directory structure. I probably also have like your the Office 14 or 12 hives, and then probably BMR from at least one of your system state machines. Now I'm just kind of off on a tangent. Look, a shiny object. All right, anyway. So I've got these pieces, but most of the data that you're actually going to choose is in a content database. What we've done in DPM 2010 is you still have to be able to mount that database, but you can mount it on any SQL server you want. You don't have to construct a SharePoint farm or recovery farm to do that. And here's a little trick. DPM ships with a copy of SQL. Okay? So you may as well load it locally. P.S. It's faster. All right? So basically this, and I should mention that. So DPM 2010 actually has a SQL Server 2008 Standard Edition engine behind it. It's what we use for our scheduling. It's what we use for our reporting services. It's SQL. So what you need is SQL. Use it. All right. So now the DPM server can actually just use any copy of SQL that you want, brings up that database, exposes the file structure, and then right from there, magically, auto-magically, in fact, that Word document just makes its way back. So you don't have to have a recovery farm concept anymore. All right. So let me kind of take you through a couple of restore scenarios. And I really apologize because I never, ever like to sit during a demo. But this keyboard is down pretty much at my kneecaps, and so there's no way for me to type. So I can see it now. The evals are going to say, I can't believe he's sat. All right, so here's what we're going to do. I'm going to switch over to the demo environment. So over here, we've been on the Protection tab. Now I'm going to go over to the Recovery tab. And on the Recovery tab, I can see things like there's my Exchange servers, my file servers, there's my SQL servers, there's my SharePoint boxes. So if I go ahead and let's start with a couple simple SharePoint options. If I go into SharePoint, there's my 2007 server, and I can see the SharePoint data underneath that. If I click on that, now I can start to see things like there's the farm itself, there's my search components, etc. Now, notice here, by the way, on the calendar-based view, if you squint just a little bit, let me see if I can go back a month. Maybe it'll help us out a little bit. I don't have any data that old. Let me come back here. There we go. So here on my SharePoint 2010 server, I've gone back to July. And notice here that I've got a couple dates which are bolder than others. Any date which is bold has recovery points. Okay, so now I can go ahead and say, you know what, I want to recover to the last Monday of the month. And sure enough, this was set with the defaults of 8 p.m. So I can pick here, I can say what kind of object I want to recover, a date, a time, and then there's my content database. And of course, from here, I can double click into that. There is my site collection, individual site, and right from here, above and beyond the two-stage recycle bin, I can recover individual objects. And they'll go straight back into the SharePoint farm from here. Now, this works pretty well if I already know exactly what that structure looks like. Some of the other things I can do from this is I can also search for files or SharePoint objects, and I can search for anything on a file name. So I can go and find anything that has, JSON or DPM or Office in it from here as a document, including a search range, and go from there. So I've got a couple different options for SharePoint. Let me show you the SQL options that kind of respect for those. So like, for example, if I go in and let's say I want to do a site. I want to take the whole site back up. Let me go back into here. That's the database itself. Now, if I choose a database for recovery, I'll get some options, like I want to recover back to the original instance of SQL. I can also recover to any other instance of SQL. By the way, I should mention that down here, these bottom two options are always the same across any workload. I can always take whatever I'm trying to restore and just drop the files out to a network folder someplace. I can also always restore to a tape. And by the way, that's not a typo. That's restore to tape, not restore from tape. And I'll tell you how that works in just a minute. But that's when I chose a database. Now look what happens if I go into that content database, go into an individual object. Let's just do a site. If I want to say I want to recover the site, now I can just take that site and I can put it back someplace else, or I can recover it to a different site. So now I can have my production site, which is live, and I can recover that to a different location someplace else, so I could actually use for testing or archival purposes. So notice how the top options will vary based on what I'm choosing to recover, to what level of granularity I have. Now you'll see the same thing from a SQL perspective. If I open up, say, one of my SQL databases, there's that customer database. Now if I go ahead and say I want to go back, let's go to last month again. Same kind of experience. Now remember, SharePoint's VSS writer on its own does not have a transaction log. Okay, the SQL databases underneath it do, but SharePoint does not. And therefore I'm going to have multiple points in time, but they're going to be every few hours. SQL, I can replicate every 15 minutes. So using the same policy, here are those 15-minute marks. Now let's say, for example, I'm the accounting guy, and I say, you know what, I want to go ahead and take that payroll database, and I want it to the last day of the month. There we go, at close of business. Now I want to restore that payroll database. And again, I've chosen a database, so I'm going to get SQL-specific options, like I want to recover that database to the original instance of SQL, put it back where it came from. Or, just like we saw in SharePoint, I can recover that database to any other SQL server in my environment. I can also recover to folder. I can also recover to tape. And I want to talk about tape for a second. I always used to talk about this when we talk about accounting and SQL. Here's a pet peeve of mine. Accounting guy calls me a few weeks after the close of the month and says, hey, I need a copy of that tape. Okay. I need it for an offsite vault. I need it for the auditor. I need it for a judge. Whatever the case might be. I really don't want to give them that tape for a couple reasons. One, that tape has got a lot of extra data on it. And it may not even be relevant to the point in time they want. But you saw what I did. I chose a database. That was mouse click number 1. I chose a date. I chose a time. And now this last option says I can recover that database to just that date and time to its own tape. And that's the tape that should go to an offsite auditor or vault or to a judge, etc. All right. So if I go into one other thing I should show you here, if I right-click on that database, remember I said earlier that, I am not a DBA. So if I want to say put this someplace else. Now, by the way, I should tell you, this is a SQL 2005 database. And I'm going to go ahead and restore it to a SQL 2008 server. So I'm going to go ahead and pick my 2008 box. It'll take a few seconds to enumerate the different instances of SQL that are there. Let's go ahead and drop it on my legal instance. I don't really care. And this is going to be my July payroll. I just need to run one more report. One last thing I didn't get a chance to do last month. And then I can go ahead and decide where that MDF and that LDF are going to be. And say OK. Now, as a non-DBA, which is what I am, is this on? OK. I can go and restore it like this. As I mentioned before, if I was a DBA, I can go ahead and restore the database to the first thing that morning, give you the logs, but not play them forward. So that then a DBA can then play the transactions forward to literally any transaction within that journal. Again, I'm not a DBA. I'll go ahead and take it every 15 minutes. Do I want to throttle the bandwidth as part of that? Do I want to use SAN-based recovery? Do I want to use email notification and tell the DBA that I've done this? All of those will take the defaults. Here's all the various components and pieces, and I'll say recover. So this is going to take a few seconds. And so while it's doing that, I'm going to change over and I want to show you the thing we're probably most excited about with SQL and those kind of workloads. And by the way, this works for any SQL database. So I can go ahead and now with DPM 2010, I have something called the Data Protection Manager Self-Service Recovery Tool for SQL Server. Marketing guys got really carried away with, anyway, long title, but here's what you want to do. You'll double click on that. I'm going to go ahead and connect to one of my DPM servers. And now I'm going to go ahead and create a new recovery job. Now, this new recovery job, hopefully these screens look a little familiar to you now. Remember, this is from the SQL Management Console. This could just as easily be from the DBA's laptop. I'm going to say next. I can choose an instance of SQL of what's being protected. So if I go to that accounting instance, there's that payroll database again. Here's my date-based view. I'm going to go ahead and do it from, say, earlier this month. Any 15-minute point in time that I want. Say next. And I can drop that again to any other instance of SQL. And the behavior here is the exact same thing that you saw from before. You choose the database, you choose the path name directory, and it goes from here. But we're enabling the DBA to do it themselves. All good? There's one other option I actually can't show you on this particular set of servers, but there's also the ability called latest. And if you're a DBA, I think it's the coolest feature for you. Remember, DPM is going to protect the data every 15 minutes. So that means the worst case scenario is something breaks 14 and a half minutes from your last sync point. Right? If you follow the best practice that says that your databases are on one volume and your logs are on a separate volume, then here's what will happen. On that pull-down list, you'll see another option. You'll see the option called latest. Go to today in the calendar, pull that list, and right after, let's say a server died at 11:29. Okay, I've got the recovery point from 11 o'clock. I've got the recovery point from 11:15. I don't have 11:29 yet. I was just about to start, darn it. Okay, instead, I can pull the word latest down from that pull-down list. And what latest means is after DPM goes ahead and restores all the data that we have, which is 11:15, since you followed that best practice, we will go ahead and play forward your transaction logs from 11:15:01 through to when that last committed transaction is done. All you did on that pull-down list was choose the word latest instead, and you are within one committed op of when that SQL server went down. All right. Let me finish it off. One last thing, and I think I've got like 4 minutes, so I'm actually tracking pretty well for time. because SharePoint actually does use SQL Server on the back end, one thing I do kind of want to make you aware of. Now, this is not what I would consider a completely wholly supported scenario, but it's something I want to make you aware of because in the right business scenarios, it makes sense. And that is, remember that most of what you need in SharePoint Farm is actually just SQL databases. And as I mentioned a little while ago, while SharePoint does not have a transaction log of its own, which means you don't get the 15-minute sync points, SQL Server does. So if you have a SharePoint farm which has critical data on it and say a 4-hour recovery point window is not frequent enough for you and you want to take advantage of that 15-minute function, you can actually choose to back up the SQL databases as SQL. Okay? But there's a couple things you want to be aware of when you do that. Okay, so this is what I want to do. I want to back them up directly. The idea here is that if I've got my SharePoint farm, so I've got my application servers, I've got my web front end, I'm going to catch all my customizations and that kind of thing. I'm going to catch those from the top, and then underneath that I've got all my SQL Server databases. If I do that, what you're going to want to do is either do a bare metal recovery of the application server or the web front end components, meaning that those are physical boxes, or if your web front end if your web front-end server is a virtual server, it's a VM, then go ahead and just do a backup from the Hyper-V perspective underneath it. But either way, what you need to do is you need to make sure you're capturing the entire web front-ender in its own state. That's going to capture all your customizations, and more importantly, it's going to capture pretty much everything besides the SQL databases themselves. Once you know you've got that, then you can go ahead and say, okay, I'm just going to protect SQL as SQL. And the reason that's important is because when you use the SharePoint VSS writer and DPM the way we've been talking about it so far, we already handle all the intermix between what's in the content databases and what's in the metadata and how it relates to the whole farm. But you don't get the transactional 15-minute windows. If you want to get the 15-minute windows, you have to back up SQL, but recognize what you're going to be doing then is this is when you're going to be recovering the whole database, not as a database, not just recovering the farm. Okay, so be aware of that. But in the right scenario where you really want to minimize the RTO or the RPO, excuse me, of the databases themselves, this is an option that you want to think about. There are pros and cons for this, and actually just in respect of time, you can download these slides, and if you have any questions, send them to me as jbuff@microsoft.com. All right, a couple things that I hope you take away. Please know the main reason, or one of the primary reasons why Microsoft built DPM was for SharePoint and SQL, so that you have a wholly supported backup and recovery experience for those workloads. Because candidly, if you really think about Microsoft, we're much more committed to Exchange and SharePoint and SQL and Windows than we are necessarily to, let's go build a backup product, right? We built this for you as SharePoint users and SQL and Hyper-V, et cetera. I've already given you a lot of the options as far as what the scaling limits are for DPM 2010. Certainly some of the things I hope I highlighted today were some of the auto protection, auto grow, auto heal options. And if I was going to ask you to do one thing when you leave today, and that is when you're looking at deploying SharePoint 2010, or you're looking at deploying SQL Server 2008 R2, or Hyper-V R2, or Exchange 2010, when you're working at those new workloads and you start to realize that some of your legacy solutions, the legacy backup isn't going to address those scenarios yet, hopefully you'll think about Microsoft's backup recovery for that. All right, as I mentioned, I have one more session on DPM, which is tomorrow. It is back in the server track, server 315. We're going to take all the data we've been protecting from SharePoint and SQL and Exchange and Hyper-V, and I'm going to actually, or except for Hyper-V, I'm going to protect some Hyper-V VMs, and I'm going to replicate data from one server to another and give you some disaster recovery capabilities. All right. I think I've got like 2 minutes left. Quick show of hands again. If you are currently using DPM 2010 today, raise your hand. Okay, I got about 10 people so far. It's been out for about a month and a half, so thank you so much for that. Who using DPM 2010 is protecting, I'll keep 2007 as well. If you're using DPM and you're protecting over 50 data sources, raise your hands. Okay, how about 100? Okay, how many have you got? Roughly? What workloads? Louder. SQL, Exchange, SharePoint, Hyper-V. The whole mix? Yeah. Okay. What about you? 60. You said 60? You said 56? Come on up afterwards. I'd like to give you a copy of my book. Thank you so much. All right. And lastly, Q&A. I'm going to do this right outside. I need just a few minutes to shut down these VMs because they're going to go across the hall for this afternoon. Other than that, your evals are important. They're important for two reasons. One, we really want to make sure that you're getting the right kind of content at TechEd. So please give us your feedback, what you liked, what you didn't like, etc. Especially important because the track owner is in the room and he decides whether I come back next year or not. So evals are really important for both those reasons. With that in mind, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of TechEd, and I hope to see you around. Thank you.